If you've spent any time in churches, at some point you're going to hear the story of the wisdom of Solomon from First Kings 3:16 to 28. This story is so well known that it is, in fact, entered into our cultural lingo with an expression, a rather horrifying expression, to be clear, splitting the baby. So the story is this: there are these two prostitutes that come to Solomon and they want him to judge who is the rightful mother of an infant. The one prostitute says that the other one killed inadvertently her infant and then stole the first one's infant in the middle of the night. And the other one says, no, this is in fact my infant. She's the dead infant is hers. And so they're going back and forth. And Solomon has to judge who is the proper mother of this particular infant. So we read beginning in verse 24. Then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order: cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was deeply moved out of love for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. The other said, neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two. Then the king gave his ruling: give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother. When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. It's an interesting story, and as I said, with the expression of splitting the baby, this has become a metaphor for finding a way out of a seemingly impossible, irresolvable situation with some particular intriguing and brilliant resolution. But is it really that brilliant of a story? Some years ago, I was reading Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. And in the beginning, he had a section where he talks about all these passages of biblical violence and how the Judeo-Christian tradition has interpreted them and how often to modern eyes they actually appear enormously problematic. And one of them is precisely this story of Solomon proposing to split the baby. So this is how Pinker puts it. He says, so one of the babies dies, and each woman claims that the surviving boy is hers. The wise king Solomon adjudicates the dispute by pulling out a sword and threatening to butcher the baby and hand each woman a piece of the bloody corpse. One woman withdraws her claim, and Solomon awards the baby to her. Now, that, of course, then, that's a summary of the story, and this is where the traditional interpretation concludes this is a sign of the brilliance of Solomon as a wise judge. But this is what Pinker says. The distancing effect of a good story can make us forget the brutality of the world in which it was set. Just imagine a judge in family court today adjudicating a maternity dispute by pulling out a chainsaw and threatening to butcher the baby before the disputant's eyes. Solomon was confident that the more humane woman would reveal herself, and he must have been prepared in the event he was wrong to carry out the butchery or else forfeit all credibility. Now, that perfectly illustrates the tension with the text. The story makes sense, and Solomon seems wise within the world of the text. But the second you attempt to apply the same principles that are held as wise within the text in contemporary society, they do not appear wise at all. They appear reckless and immoral. In terms of recklessness, think about it like this. I mean, Solomon assumes that the person who is the legitimate biological mother of the child will act in the child's best interest. And that may be the case, but that's not something one can assume. And it's certainly not something on which one would potentially stake the life of an infant in order to find out. Human psychology isn't like that. Some mothers, biological mothers, are bad people in that they don't care really for the welfare of their child. So to make the adjudication based simply upon the speculation that the biological mother would more likely act within the self-interest or the interest of the child is really a pretty weak basis on which to make a judgment like this and potentially imperil the life of an innocent child. And this brings us to a second point. It's wrong to make a judgment that would impose an immoral penalty. And certainly, killing, dismembering an infant is an immoral penalty. Now, you could say, yeah, but Solomon knew that the right woman somehow, or he had a reasonable belief that the right woman would emerge, and thus that he wouldn't have to carry out the unjust sentence. But I would simply say, even imposing an unjust sentence that you never intend to carry out in and of itself is wrong. Think, for example, about a child who refuses to clean his room. And so the father points a gun at his head and says, if you don't clean your room, I'm going to kill you. Later on, the father points out that, in fact, there never were any bullets in the chamber of the gun and he never had any intent of killing his child. Does that make it okay that he threatened to kill the child? Of course not. The issue isn't simply that counterfactually he would have killed the child. The problem is also that, in fact, he did issue an immoral threat, even if he never intended to carry it out. And certainly, it is obvious that to threaten to dismember an infant is an immoral threat. So it's not just the counterfactual possibility that he might have been forced to carry it out, even if he never would have carried it out. To make the threat itself is immoral and thus wrong. And for these reasons, I think we can say the decision, although it is accepted as wise within the world of the text, we wouldn't consider it wise. We don't think that that's how one should make a judgment and adjudication as to who was the rightful mother in this case. So, to conclude, where do we go from here? The one thing I want to say is that I think that by pushing back at the text and at judgments made within the world of the text and saying, I don't agree necessarily with those judgments. First of all, I think that we should make those judgments with some degree of fear and trembling in the sense that we recognize our own limitations as human beings. We have not arrived at the end of history. We do not see all things as they ought to be. We do not have perfect moral understanding or perfect prudential understanding or wisdom. And so to recognize that we think there are fundamental flaws in the wisdom and understanding and morality of the story is also a recognition that there can be profound flaws in terms of the wisdom, judgment, and understanding of ourselves. The story, we should not just judge the story, we should use the story as the reflexive basis to judge ourselves as well, and thus to ask ourselves, where am I thinking something is a wise, prudent, and moral judgment, which it may not be. So it's not just that we're judging the text, we're using the text to reflect on our own lives and our own limitations and to judge ourselves. And I think that whole process is a part of the dynamic of being through Israel. To be Israel has always been to wrestle with God and to wrestle with the text. And to push back on the judgment that Solomon was maximally wise when he threatened to dismember an infant, push back on that is not irreverent, it's not immoral. It's acting upon some basic moral dictates and I think wise prudential judgment, and to dialogue with the text and then use the text again to reflect on ourselves. And I think that is exactly what we should be doing as true Israel. What we shouldn't be doing is simply using the text in a flat way to say, wasn't Solomon wise by threatening to dismember the infant? Precisely because we know that today it would not be wise. And wisdom doesn't change. I mean, something is either wise or it's not. It's either moral or it's not. Do not let biblicists impose on you some kind of moral relativism or prudential relativism. In Proverbs, here's the irony when you talk about prudence or wisdom, the Proverbs are offering timeless principles, nuggets of wisdom, right? They're not arguing, they're not saying, raise a child in the fear of the Lord, and when he is old, he will not depart from that. They're not saying, well, that was applicable in the ancient Near East, but it's not applicable in 21st century North America or something. No, these are our timeless principles, but they're not absolute principles. They're just good general guides. But they are transcultural. It's the same thing with dismembering babies. It's not wise. It wasn't wise then, it's not wise now. We have a better lens on that now than the original author and audience of the text may have had. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them in all sorts of other ways and also be challenged in our own limitations of our perspective.